a way, a sound way of knowing things. And indeed, the Quran, the Hadith, and the Seerah, this is the way they've been translated to us. So the next page you can go 48. وكم حبث ثويبية من بركة لما غدت ذئرا له وبركة إذ حضنته ثم بعد الأم غدا كفيل الجد ثم العم. So he had other wet nurses. Thuwayba was one, and she was Abu Lahab, who was the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ. And we all know Abu Lahab because he's mentioned in the Quran, not in a very flattering way actually, because he's one of the few people that actually mentioned by name in the Quran who will be destined for the hellfire. So despite him being the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, he was one of his staunchest opponents. But one of the things that he did upon the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, that he was so happy for the birth of his nephew, that he had a bondwoman, a slave, called Thuwayba. And Thuwayba, he freed her that day that he was born, ﷺ. Why? Because of his happiness. So some of the hadith mentioned that the punishment that will come down on Abu Lahab will be reduced on Mondays, the day the Prophet ﷺ was born, because of that what he did by freeing Thuwayba. And Thuwayba actually was one of the first, even before Halima, to nurse the Prophet ﷺ. So Thuwayba actually also lived a barakah, a life of barakah as a result. Another one that also nursed the Prophet ﷺ was another lady by the name of Barakah. So Barakah is, if I can just recall here, so Barakah was another wet nurse from amongst the people of Mecca who nursed the Prophet ﷺ just for a few days before Halima. So the first one was Thuwayba, then Barakah in terms of chronological order, and then Halima was the one who nursed him the longest for the 2 years and then some for the Prophet ﷺ. إِذْ حَضَنَتْهُ ثُمَّ بَعْدَ الْأُمِّ. And Barakah was the one who actually took care of the Prophet ﷺ after the death of his mother, because she was in the household of the grandfather, Abdul Muttalib. So when the Prophet ﷺ was just 4, his mother passed away, Amina bint Wahab. So the Prophet ﷺ then is orphaned at a very early age. He never knew his father, died in utero, in the womb, and then his mother was passed away when he was just 4. So he was orphaned. And some said that the wisdom behind the Prophet ﷺ being orphaned from 2 aspects. One, an aspect for him and an aspect for us. One, the aspect for him is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala became his mother and his father and his everything. Right? He did have family members, he did have his grandfather who also passed away, and later his uncle. But then it had to be that way, right? That the Prophet ﷺ was kind of singularly for the ummah. That's why the Prophet ﷺ also left no sons behind. Right? He had one son, Ibrahim, which we're going to get to later, who passed away in infancy. Right? And the Quran tells us that the Prophet ﷺ is not the father of any amongst you. Right? وَأَزْوَاجُهُ أُمَّهَاتُكُمْ. But his wives are like the mothers of the believers. So that's why we call the mothers, or the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, the mothers of the believers. Because he had to be completely and solely for the ummah. Right? People nowadays, when they're in their prayer, when they're in their sujood, they think about their kids. You guys one day will do this, and your parents do this for you now, I guarantee you. Right? They'll say, and especially if you're far away, they don't know where you are, they'll say, my son, my Mosaad, and the other people, and by name in their sujood. Right? That's who they're thinking about, that's who they're worried about. When the Prophet ﷺ would be in dua and sujood, what would he say? He didn't say mention his children. He had daughters, he had 4 daughters, but besides them, he would say ummati. He would say my ummah, my ummah, my ummah. So always his concern was the ummah. So he's kind of like the father figure of that ummah, and by the same token, he is the one also without father. Right? And he's also the one without mother. And when the Prophet ﷺ says, أَدَّبَنِي رَبِّي فَأَحْسَنَ تَأْدِيبِي, right? My Lord is the one who has nurtured me, and he has done a most excellent job of nurturing me. Right? And so what he meant by that statement is that the circumstances that he's been given in his life, being orphaned at a young age, which for most people is calamitous, it's not very difficult to go through life and you don't have parents that you can lean on. But for him, he's saying this was a form of ta'deeb. This is the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually nurtured me throughout my life. So he was always having that relationship with his Lord, right? In the same way that we have that sort of dependence and reliance upon our parents often, he had that way with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not on people at all. And he was trained that way very early on. So that's the aspect in terms of the aspect from the point of view of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. From the point of view of everyone else, if the Prophet ﷺ had a father who remained, would kind of be the tribal chieftain, then people would say, you know, he's doing this for his family and he wants to bring glory to his side of the family. And even people said that despite the fact that he didn't have a father in the picture. And even when his uncle was no longer in the picture, still these were things that were being said. But the Prophet ﷺ, for us, we had to know that he was not doing this out of some type of seeking of familial glory, as it were, but he was someone completely separate from that. So that's why when the Quraysh looked at him, even though they saw a ghulam, a young man who was an orphan boy, they still called him an Amin, right? They knew about him, they knew of him, they respected him. Throughout his whole life, until he became, at 40 years of age, until he became the Prophet ﷺ, he was amongst the most respected people of Mecca. No one had an issue with him, no one had a problem with him. No one even got into a little altercation with him. Never happened. None of that has reached us that ever happened with the Prophet ﷺ. And they would always call him Ja al-Amin. They would call him Muhammad al-Amin, right? The most trustworthy one. The one that you could leave your valuables with. The one that you could leave your secrets with. That's how they viewed the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So, وخلفته أمه ابن 4 سنين والجد ابن ضعفها فاع, like twice as much. So his mother died and left him when he was just 4, and then his grandfather when he was 8. So he went to the household of his grandfather. There were other women there, like Baraka, to nurse him and take care of him. But once his grandfather, and remember his grandfather from before, Shaykh, Abdul Muttalib, right? He is the one who found Zamzam. Right? So he was kind of a major figure in Mecca. And then he passes away. And then he goes to the household of his uncle, Abu Talib. Right? And Abu Talib had other sons as well. He had Ali, or he had, actually the oldest was Aqil, then he had Ali and he had Ja'far. And Abu Talib was not a rich man, but he was, you know, the senior figure in the Banu Hashim clan now, which was the clan of the Prophet ﷺ. So he went to that whole household and lived with his uncle. And Abu Talib was like many of the Meccans, he was a trader, and he would make trips. So he would go to Syria and he'd go to Yemen to bring his wares over there, sell them, and then buy things from there to bring them back to sell in Mecca. So it says here, ثم إلى الشام مع العم ارتحل والعمر في ثالث العشر دخل. He then traveled with his uncle to Syria after he had entered his 13th year. You might say, well, what happened between he was 8 and 13? The Sirah doesn't mention specific things that happened between 8 and 13. Right? There's a number of things that happened in the early life of the Prophet ﷺ before he became a prophet at 40, even though that's 40 years of history, so to speak. We don't have a lot about that. And the reason for that would be, what do you think?
He had announced prophethood, so he wasn't that much of a historical figure.
Exactly. After he became a prophet, he told the Sahaba, they understood that everything that happens, they should be recording it. They knew, while they were living, that everything that's happening right now, people like us 1,400 years later, or 2,000 years later, how many years later, would need to know that. We need to be able to access it. So they had an eye on remembering all of these things and even documenting them, writing them down, so that people after them, like us, that's why we owe them so much, could have access to the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad. But before he was 40, it wasn't known. People saw signs, right? That's why it's recorded in the Sirah. The really amazing things, right, are recorded. But the things that are kind of mundane, everyday things, not so much. So we learned about his trip to Syria when he was about between 12 and 13. And there was a rahib over there, a rahib like a monk. And one thing that we're not so aware of these days, but people were aware of back then, is that everybody was waiting for a prophet. In other words, in their scripture, there was mention of another final prophet to come. If you read the Bible today, or even read the Torah, you will see attributes of this type of final prophet. But oftentimes they'll dismiss it and they'll say, well, that means Jesus, not another person. Or it means this. And people have done studies about that, and the paraclete that's mentioned in the Bible is one of the names that they say actually is referring to Muhammad ﷺ, the last and final prophet, and it's not referring to Jesus. And it's a Muslim belief, it's our theology, that the Bible is not in its original form anyway, so we think it's been manipulated in some way. But back then, the books of the Gospels of the Bible were probably more in a more pristine form, because it's only 600 years between them and Jesus ﷺ, not another 1400 that we have now. So many of them were anticipating the idea that there's going to be a final prophet. And many of them actually had or identified the Arabian Peninsula as where he would show up. And some of them, even to the extent, had identified Yathrib and Medina. How do we know this? From the story of Salman al-Farisi, for example. Salman al-Farisi was the prince of Persia, the real prince of Persia, right? He actually was a prince in Persia, and he had, lived a very comfortable lifestyle. He had servants, he had all these things. His family, were amongst the royalty of Persia. But he was someone who was a searcher, right? And so he rejected the Magian religion of worshiping fire. He didn't think that was hot, that was true. And he started exploring. And he actually ran into some Christians in Persia, and he started thinking about Christianity. And he would always have a teacher who was a Christian, until the one that he had in Persia died, and then he told him, there's a monk in Jerusalem, that's where you need to go. So he goes to Jerusalem, right, to search for this monk, and he finds this monk over there. And then he starts studying with the monk, and the monk tells him, but after I die, you need to go to this place where the date palm trees are, in the Arabian Peninsula, south of us, where the date palm trees are. That's how he described it to him. And the monk dies. Salman, even though he's royalty, he's not aware of the culture of the Arabian Peninsula. He doesn't know how it works. In other words, he's not aware that you just can't go there by yourself and think people are going to greet you with open arms, right? Unless you have a tribe covering your back, right? It's like your passport. They're going to ask you, who are you from, who are you coming with, who's your tribe that's protecting you here. If you don't have that, you can end up in a very bad situation very quickly. And that's exactly what happened to him. So he goes and he actually becomes enslaved. And he finds himself a slave. And he finds himself sold to various slave owners until he reaches a slave owner who lives in Yathrib, in Medina. And then he starts hearing about, there's this final prophet, there's this prophet, and he's in Mecca, and he's coming to Medina. And then that's when Prophet ﷺ comes to Medina, and Salman meets him, and then he actually was told by the monk, look for three things with this prophet to know that he's a prophet. Look for, one sign will be that he won't eat from charity. If you give him something that's charity, he won't accept it for himself. If you give something as a gift, he will accept it for himself and his friends. And you will find that whenever people are persecuting him, he only grows more benevolent. Those are the three signs. And they also mentioned to him, a fourth one, the seal of prophethood, the actual seal on his back, which comes up later here. And so Salman looked for all of those signs. So he comes to the Prophet one day and he brings this big tray of dates that he had taken from one of the palm trees, and he brings it before the Prophet ﷺ. He wasn't Muslim yet. And he said, Salman, what's this? He said, this is sadaqah, charity. He said, we don't eat sadaqah, you can give it to the people who are in need. The next day he brings another big tray, and he said, Salman, what's this? He said, it's a gift for you. He said, oh, okay, we accept the gift. Right? And then he would see that people would, the way that some would speak to him and be rough with him, and he saw that the Prophet ﷺ would only respond back in a kind way. Right? And then he said, one time the Prophet ﷺ was wearing a loose shirt, and he was trying to see the actual physical seal. And then the Prophet ﷺ said to him, Salman, are you looking for this? Right? And then he shows him the seal, and he accepted Islam at that point. So they had word of this. The Jewish tribes living in Medina also were anticipating the Prophet. Right? It's kind of a wrinkle in history. What were 3 non-Arab Jewish tribes doing in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula? Why were they there to begin with? How did they get there? What made them go there? And why was it that the people of Yathrib specifically were so receptive to the Prophet ﷺ? Right? In Mecca, out of, I don't know, several thousand, maybe 4, 5, 6,000 people who lived there, how many people became Muslim before the Hijrah? Do you know? Less than 100. Less than 100 of those thousands of people actually became Muslim, who made the Hijrah with the Prophet ﷺ. When he gets to Medina, how many people are there? At least 4,000. And overwhelmingly they become Muslim. Jewish tribes, many of them didn't become, but the 4,000 of the Aus wal Khazraj, the 2 Arab tribes, they all became Muslim. Why is that? How was it that they accepted it? And they didn't even know the Prophet ﷺ. These people in Mecca knew him. They grew up with him. He's one of them. Right? Even one of them, Al-Walead ibn Mughira, he said, after he heard some of the Quran, he went back to his people, he said, you know what? What's wrong if we follow him? Right? If he gets the glory will be ours as well. So what do we lose if we follow him? And they said, no, Muhammad has put a spell on you. He's made magic over you. He has ways of saying things. That's why the Quraysh would actually put fingers in plug their ears. They don't want to hear, because they're afraid it would affect them. So they knew they were affected by him. They knew he was Sadiq. They knew he was an Amin, but the majority of them didn't accept him. Then how is it that when he gets to Al-Medina, they accept him, and the Jews reject him? The Jewish tribes rejected him as a prophet. They didn't follow him. And they're the ones who were saying day and night to the people of Yathrib, the Aus wal Khazraj, you have to wait for this prophet. You people are idolaters. You're mushrikeen. Wait till the Prophet ﷺ comes, then he'll show you what the true deen is. And then he shows up, and it's the people who were the idolaters previously, the people of Yathrib, Aus wal Khazraj, the 2 Arab tribes, they accept Islam. And one of the reasons they accept Islam, obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's His will. But beyond that, they had already been exposed to the idea, and they grew up with the idea there's going to be a final prophet. Where did they get that from? From the Jewish tribes. Where did the Jewish tribe get it from? Their scripture. Why else would they go to Yathrib? Why else would they put themselves in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula? Right? And they lived in the mansions of Khaybar. Khaybar was a little bit outside of Medina. So unlike Mecca, Medina was much different. Medina was sort of like fortified settlements. Mecca was central. Mecca, you had the Kaaba in the middle, and people lived around it. And it was kind of a centralized type of town. Medina was not like that. Medina, you had people living in pockets, sort of like, everyone had their little neighborhood and it was fortified. And the Jewish tribes, the 3 tribes of Bani Qurayza, Qaynuqa, and Nadir,